In this gripping story, Isabella Reynolds, a judge, and her agent husband, Daniel Brooks, are celebrating their wedding when a false police report turns their perfect night into a nightmare. What starts as a joyful celebration quickly spirals into a shocking confrontation with law enforcement, revealing deep biases and abuse of power. When the couple's true identities are revealed, the consequences are far-reaching. How will they fight back, and can justice be served? Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss this incredible journey. Comment below with your thoughts and where you're watching from. Let's get into the story. The sun dipped low, casting a golden hue over the pristine backyard of the Reynolds-Brooks estate. Isabella Reynolds stood at the center of her wedding celebration, a glowing bride in a stunning white gown. Her dark, coiled hair was pulled into an elegant updo, the veil cascading down her back, shimmering in the golden hour light. Her groom, Daniel Brooks, tall and strong, stood proudly beside her, his arm draped protectively over her shoulder. Their smiles were unshakable, even as the day's light began to fade into twilight. The couple had planned an intimate yet elegant wedding in their own backyard. It wasn't about extravagance, but about the union of their families and the symbol of the life they were building together. Twinkling lights hung from the trees, soft music played in the background, and the air was filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Isabella, a well-respected judge, was known for her unrelenting pursuit of justice and fairness. Her dedication to her work had earned her admiration within the legal community, and Daniel, her equal in every way, served as an agent. Together, they formed a powerful duo, bound not just by love but by their shared values. They were surrounded by friends and family who supported and cherished them, making this day a perfect celebration of their love and commitment. Isabella's parents, Ellen and Robert Reynolds, mingled with guests, sharing stories of their daughter's achievements and beaming with pride. Daniel's mother, Patricia Brooks, had flown in from the West Coast to witness her son's special day, marveling at how her son had grown into such a strong and compassionate man. Their two families had come together seamlessly, reflecting the unity that Isabella and Daniel embodied. Yet, just a few houses down the street, not everyone shared the joy of the evening. Dorothy Kane, an elderly neighbor who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, sat in her living room, her bony fingers pulling at the edge of her lace curtains. Her sharp, narrowed eyes watched the gathering in Isabella and Daniel's backyard with growing discontent. Dorothy had never been shy about her distaste for what she considered outsiders, especially when those outsiders didn't look like her or didn't fit the image of what she believed her neighborhood should be. Dorothy reached for her phone, her fingers trembling with the weight of her intentions. She dialed the number she knew all too well. Her voice, sharp and agitated, carried her story to the dispatcher. Noise complaints, suspicious activity, and veiled accusations about a large group in the house down the street. She spoke as if there was something truly wrong about a joyous wedding gathering, twisting the narrative to suit her prejudice. "I don't know what's going on," she said, her voice shaking with manufactured worry, "but I think you should come by. They're making a lot of noise, and there's a lot of them." At the police precinct, Officer James Miller received the call. He exchanged glances with his partner, Officer Bradley, and a small smirk crept across his face. A quiet evening on patrol had just gotten more interesting. Without much hesitation, they geared up and headed toward the upscale neighborhood where Isabella and Daniel lived. Their faces showed no signs of understanding the joyous occasion they were about to disturb. Back at the wedding, laughter and conversation flowed seamlessly as the sun sank lower, casting warm shades of pink and orange across the sky. Isabella was deep in conversation with her childhood friend Lisa, while Daniel entertained his uncle Tom with stories from his days in training at Quantico. The children ran through the yard, their giggles rising with the clinking of glasses as toasts were made. It was the perfect evening, the kind that would live in memories for years to come. But none of them noticed the approaching storm, lurking just outside the hedge that bordered the property. No one saw the police cruisers pulling to a stop just beyond the driveway, their headlights cutting through the twilight. No one heard the low murmur of the officers' voices as they prepared to approach the celebration. Isabella turned toward Daniel, her face glowing with happiness. "I think we did it," she whispered, her eyes sparkling. "We managed to pull off the perfect day." Daniel smiled back, his eyes full of love and admiration. "I never doubted it for a second." But as they stood there, savoring the moment, a subtle shift in the atmosphere began to spread through the crowd. It started with one of the younger guests, a teenage cousin, noticing the flashing lights reflected in the windows. The murmurs began to ripple through the guests, soft at first, then growing in volume. "What's going on?" someone whispered. "I think there are police outside," another voice said, uncertainty creeping into the tone. Isabella and Daniel exchanged a glance, concern knitting their brows. Daniel instinctively placed a protective hand on Isabella's back. "Stay calm," he said softly. "I'll handle this." Together they moved toward the source of the disturbance. The joy they had felt moments earlier was quickly being replaced by a knot of anxiety forming in their stomachs. As they neared the gate, the flashing red and blue lights came into full view, a harsh contrast to the soft ambiance of the wedding. 4 police officers, including Officer Miller, stood in the driveway, their expressions stern and unfriendly. Officer Miller stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. "We've received reports of a disturbance here," he said, his voice cold and authoritative. "We need to investigate." Isabella, ever the professional, took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Good evening, officer. This is a private eventor wedding, actually. I believe there's been some misunderstanding." Miller's eyes swept over her with disdain, as if the sight of a confident woman of color asserting herself was something he couldn't tolerate. "We'll see about that," he muttered, waving his hand toward the other officers, who began moving into the crowd, questioning guests and casting suspicious glances around the yard. Daniel stepped up beside his wife, his expression steady, though a knot of frustration tightened in his chest. "Officer, there's no need for this. We're happy to answer any questions, but this is a peaceful wedding. Nothing more." But Officer Miller wasn't listening. He gestured to his fellow officers to spread out further, and the tone of the event shifted dramatically. Guests who had thought this might be a minor misunderstanding began to feel a growing sense of unease. The officers moved through the crowd with an air of authority that felt more like intimidation, and it became clear that they were not interested in simply investigating a noise complaint. As the officers questioned the guests, Isabella and Daniel stood at the center of their wedding, watching in disbelief as their perfect evening dissolved into something dark and unsettling. The unspoken prejudice in the officers' demeanor was clear, and the couple realized that this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something much more troubling. The rumble of the police cars rolling into the driveway had shattered the serenity of the evening. A joyous wedding was now overshadowed by the weight of flashing lights, uniforms, and suspicion. Guests who had been laughing and mingling only moments ago now stood in small, anxious groups, watching the officers with uncertain eyes. Isabella stood tall, her hand gently placed on Daniel's arm as they approached the officers. She was calm, determined not to let fear or frustration show on her face. She had spent years in courtrooms, fighting for justice and fairness, and she wasn't about to let a group of misguided officers intimidate her. "Officer," she began again, her tone even and professional. "This is a wedding celebration. We have all the necessary permits, and there's no criminal activity here. I assure you there's no need for concern." Miller's gaze swept over her again, unimpressed. He seemed to be looking for something, anything to justify his actions. His hand never left the holster on his belt as he replied, "Well, be the judge of that, ma'am. Step back and let us do our job." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew the tone all too well, the one that dismissed everything before it was even considered. It was the voice of someone who had already made up their mind. "Officer," Daniel said, his voice firm but controlled, "we understand you're responding to a call, but this is unnecessary. We're more than willing to cooperate, but I'm telling you, this is just a wedding." Miller's expression remained stony. He wasn't interested in explanations. As the officers continued to move through the crowd, Isabella's parents exchanged worried glances. Her father, Robert, looked pale under the flickering lights, his concern for his daughter growing with every passing minute. Meanwhile, Daniel's brother, Henry, a lawyer, stepped forward to offer his legal expertise, but the officers brushed him off as if his words held no weight. The mood of the wedding had shifted from joyous to anxious. Guests who had come to celebrate love and unity now felt the cold fingers of fear creeping over them. Isabella could feel the knot of frustration tightening in her chest. This wasn't just a noise complaint, it was something much deeper, much uglier. And it was only the beginning. The backyard, once filled with laughter and celebration, was now thick with tension. The soft glow of the twinkling lights seemed dim against the harsh blue and red flashes of the police cruisers. Guests stood still, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief, as the officers wove through the crowd with an unsettling sense of authority. What had started as a beautiful wedding night was rapidly unraveling into a scene of unwarranted intimidation. Isabella's mind raced as she tried to maintain her composure. She knew she had to defuse the situation before it escalated further. With her years of experience as a judge, she was no stranger to difficult situations, but this watching her friends and family being treated as suspects felt deeply personal. "Officer, please," Isabella said firmly, stepping toward Miller again. "This isn't necessary. You're frightening our guests. If you believe there's an issue, we can resolve it peacefully. But this isn't how it should be handled." Officer Miller's eyes narrowed. His hand remained on his belt, the faintest hint of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Mom, I suggest you let us handle this. We've got reports of suspicious activity, and we need to check things out. Now step aside." Isabella took a deep breath, trying to keep her frustration in check. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back as a silent reminder to stay calm. But he, too, was starting to feel the weight of the situation, the knot of unease tightening in his chest. This wasn't just about a wedding, it was about something much darker, something they both recognized but had hoped would never invade their lives so openly. As the officers moved deeper into the crowd, their questioning became more aggressive. One officer, Officer Bradley, approached a group of teenage guests, his tone sharp as he asked for IDs. The teens, clearly scared, fumbled for their wallets, their hands shaking under the officer's watchful gaze. "Why are they being questioned like this?" One of the guests, Sarah, a longtime friend of Isabella, asked, her voice trembling as she approached Isabella. "This isn't right." "I know," Isabella said softly, her eyes darting around the yard. "Just stay calm. We'll get through this." But staying calm was becoming increasingly difficult. Across the yard, Daniel saw one of the officers patting down a teenage boy, Jamal, a family friend's son, who was barely 15 years old. The boy's hands were raised in the air, his eyes wide with fear as the officer's hands roughly searched him. "Hey, that's a child!" Daniel's voice rang out, cutting through the tense air. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the officer. "You have no reason to be searching him like that." The officer glanced up, his face hardening. "Back off," he barked, his hand moving toward the baton on his belt. "This is a police investigation." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening as he fought the urge to act. He had faced countless tense situations in his career as an agent, but this was different. This was his family, his friends, his wedding. And now they were being treated like criminals for no reason other than the color of their skin and the baseless accusations of a prejudiced neighbor. Isabella saw the conflict brewing between Daniel and the officer, and quickly moved to her husband's side, placing a hand on his arm. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling in her chest. "Not like this. We can't let them escalate this any further." Daniel's eyes met hers, the fury in his gaze softening just enough to keep him grounded. He nodded slightly, taking a step back but keeping his eyes on the officer, his presence a silent warning. But the situation wasn't calming down. The officers, emboldened by Miller's authority and the passive fear of the guests, continued their aggressive tactics. One officer began separating groups, ordering people to stand aside, while others asked for identification. The joyful hum of the evening had been replaced by the cold, sharp commands of the officers, and the air was thick with tension and disbelief. Isabella's father, Robert, approached one of the officers, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Officer, please," he began, his voice calm but pleading. "This is a wedding. These are good people. There's no need for this kind of treatment." The officer, however, wasn't interested in hearing Robert's reasoning. "Step back, sir," he snapped, his hand resting on his holster. "Well, decide what needs to be done here." Isabella could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to de-escalate the situation. She knew the law, and she knew their rights, but none of that seemed to matter right now. The officers were acting with unchecked power, driven by a prejudice that was impossible to ignore. She moved toward the lead officer again, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Miller, you're overstepping your bounds. We have all the necessary permits for this event, and there's been no criminal activity here. You're frightening our guests and violating their rights." Miller turned to face her, his expression hardening. "Mom, if you continue to interfere, we'll have to take action against you," he warned, his voice cold. "You're obstructing our investigation." The words hit Isabella like a slap to the face. Obstructing? This wasn't an investigation, it was a show of power. She felt the knot of frustration tighten in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't just about her and Daniel. This was about protecting everyone hereabout, standing up for their rights, even in the face of this blatant abuse of authority. "We're not obstructing anything," Isabella said, her voice steady. "We're asserting our rights."
"And you have no grounds to search or detain anyone here without cause."
Miller's gaze darkened, his hand twitching toward his belt. "That's enough," he snapped. "If you don't back down, you'll be spending the night in a cell." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. For a moment, the entire yard seemed to hold its breath. And then, without warning, the situation exploded. The calm Isabella had tried to maintain shattered as the officers began to move with more aggression. One of them grabbed Jamal's arm, pulling the frightened teenager toward the police cruiser parked near the gate. "No," the boy's mother Tina shouted, rushing forward. "That's my son. You can't take him." Another officer stepped in her path, blocking her with a hand on her chest. "Step back, Mom," he ordered. Tina's eyes were wide with panic, her hands trembling as she tried to reach for her son. "Please, he's done nothing wrong." Across the yard, Isabella's mother, Ellen, watched in horror as the scene unfolded. She clutched her husband's arm, her voice shaking. "Robert, what's happening? Why are they doing this?" Robert's face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know," he said quietly, his voice thick with worry. "But it's not right." The guests, too, began to grow more vocal, their murmurs of confusion turning into shouts of protest. "This is a wedding," someone shouted. "Why are you treating us like criminals?" The officers, however, were no longer listening. They had shifted from passive intimidation to outright aggression, their actions growing more forceful with every protest from the guests. And then it happened. One of the officers, in a sudden burst of violence, shoved an elderly guest to the ground. The man, Mr. Harris, a family friend, fell hard, his cane clattering to the ground beside him as he cried out in pain. That was the breaking point. Isabella's voice rang out, clear and sharp. "Stop! Stop this now!" she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "You're violating our rights." But the officers weren't stopping. Instead, they moved faster, their commands growing louder as they tried to regain control of the situation. More guests were pulled aside, hands forced behind their backs, as they were detained without cause. Daniel's heart raced as he watched the chaos unfold. He had seen scenes like this before on the job, intense situations where things spiraled out of control. But never had he imagined he would witness it at his own wedding, with the people he loved being treated like criminals. Without thinking, Daniel surged forward, his instincts taking over as he moved to protect his guests. "You need to stop!" he shouted, his voice filled with anger. "This isn't right." But before he could reach the officer who had shoved Mr. Harris, two other officers grabbed him, pulling him back. "You're under arrest," one of them said coldly, shoving Daniel to the ground. Isabella's world spun as she watched her husband fall. This was her worst nightmare. She rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Daniel," she screamed, but before she could reach him, an officer grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. "You're interfering with a police investigation," the officer growled, pulling her roughly toward the police car. The pain shot through Isabella's arm, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of hearing her cry out. She gritted her teeth, her jaw tight as she was forced into the back of the cruiser. Her heart raced, her mind a blur as she watched the officers drag Daniel toward another car. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But it was, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The last thing she saw before the cruiser door slammed shut was the horrified faces of her guests, her friends and family who had come to celebrate love and unity, now watching in disbelief as the wedding turned into a nightmare. The hum of the police cruiser's engine was a stark contrast to the silence in the back seat, where Isabella sat, her wrists sore from the tight handcuffs digging into her skin. The officer driving the vehicle didn't look back, his face emotionless, as if what had just unfolded was routine. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to keep calm. Panic wouldn't help. Tears welled in her eyes, but she swallowed them down, refusing to give in to despair. She had to stay strong for herself, for Daniel, and for everyone else who had been caught in this nightmare. From the corner of her eye, she saw Daniel being dragged toward another police cruiser. His suit was rumpled, dirt streaked his pants, and his face was set in a tight expression of defiance. Officer Miller was standing by, barking orders to his men as they continued rounding up guests, treating the wedding as though it were a crime scene. In that moment, Isabella felt the full weight of what was happening, and a chilling realization hit her. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or a case of mistaken identity. This was a deliberate abuse of power, fueled by the racial biases of a neighbor who had been looking for any reason to cause trouble. The police had taken that call as permission to exert control, and now they were escalating it far beyond anything reasonable. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but with her hands bound, she couldn't reach it. The cruiser slowed as they pulled away from the house, and for the first time, Isabella realized the guests were still watching, silent, in shock, unsure of what to do. She caught a glimpse of her parents, Ellen and Robert, standing on the porch, their faces pale with fear. Her heart ached for them. They hadn't done anything wrong. None of them had. Isabella closed her eyes, taking a deep breath to calm her rising anger. This will not be the end, she thought. We'll fight this. We'll show them who we are. The scene outside was chaotic, with guests being divided into groups, some forced into the backs of squad cars, while others were questioned with thinly veiled accusations. Henry, Daniel's brother, stood in front of several of their elderly relatives, trying to protect them from the officers who had started moving through the yard, asking for IDs and aggressively separating people. One officer, standing near Tina, the mother of Jamal, continued to detain her son, his grip tight on the boy's arm. "Where were you when the call came in, kid?" the officer asked Jamal, his voice dripping with suspicion. Jamal, barely able to keep his voice steady, replied, "Tu was just standing with my mom." "That's so." The officer's eyes narrowed, as though the teenager's words were some kind of challenge. "You look nervous." "Got something to hide." "I'm not hiding anything," Jamal stammered, glancing desperately at his mother, who was on the verge of tears. "That's enough," Henry snapped, stepping in between Jamal and the officer. "This is harassment. You have no reason to detain him." The officer's expression hardened. "Step back," he growled, taking a menacing step toward Henry. "Unless you want to join the rest of them." Henry didn't flinch. "I'm a lawyer," he said coolly, "and I'm advising you to stop this right now. You're crossing a line." The officer's gaze flicked to Henry's outstretched hand, but he didn't back down. Instead, another officer called out from behind, "Miller, we've got enough people rounded up. Let's wrap this up." Officer Miller, who had been glaring at the crowd from a distance, stepped forward. He glanced at his watch, as if this was merely an inconvenience that had gone on for too long. "All right," Miller barked. "Round them up and bring them in. We'll sort it out at the station." Back at the police station, Isabella and Daniel were led into separate holding areas. The cold, sterile walls seemed to close in on them as they were processed like common criminals, fingerprinted, photographed, and questioned. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Isabella sat on a hard bench, her mind spinning. She had spent her life defending the law, ensuring that justice was served, but here she was, trapped on the other side of it, her rights being violated by the very system she had sworn to protect. It was surreal and yet all too real. Daniel, on the other hand, was struggling to keep his temper in check. He knew that reacting with anger would only make things worse, but watching Isabella being treated this way, knowing that their family and friends were still out there, confused and scared, was more than he could bear. After what felt like hours, they were finally brought together in a small interrogation room. Officer Miller stood across from them, arms crossed over his chest, his smirk unmistakable. "Well, well," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Looks like the party's over." Isabella met his gaze, her face calm but her eyes burning with fury. "This is an illegal detention," she said, her voice firm. "We have done nothing wrong, and your actions tonight are in clear violation of our rights." Miller snorted. "You think you can lawyer your way out of this?" Daniel stepped forward, his hands still bound in front of him. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Miller raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, really? And who exactly am I dealing with?" Isabella straightened her back, standing as tall as her shackled wrists would allow. "I'm Judge Isabella Reynolds. I have served in the judiciary for over 10 years, upholding the law with integrity and fairness. And you, Officer Miller, are in direct violation of not just my civil rights, but the rights of every person you detained tonight." Miller blinked, the smirk faltering for just a moment. "A judge, huh?" he muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. But then, as if trying to regain control of the situation, he shrugged. "Doesn't change anything. You're still under arrest." Daniel's voice cut through the room like ice. "And I'm Daniel Brooks, agent." The effect was immediate. The color drained from Miller's face as the weight of Daniel's words sunk in. The other officers in the room exchanged nervous glances, suddenly realizing that this was far bigger than a noise complaint. Your agent," one of the officers stammered. Daniel nodded slowly. "That's right. And you've just unlawfully detained a federal agent and a sitting judge. I hope you understand the gravity of your situation." For a moment there was silence in the room. Miller's jaw clenched as he tried to process what had just happened. The smug arrogance he had worn all night had been replaced with uncertainty, and, beneath that, fear. This wasn't just a routine arrest anymore. This was a ticking time bomb that could blow up in his face. But instead of backing down, Miller doubled down. "I don't care who you are," he spat, his voice thick with anger. "You're not above the law." Isabella's gaze never wavered. "No one is above the law," she said quietly. "Especially not you." The next few hours passed in a blur of tension and whispered conversations. The officers, who had once been so eager to exert their authority, were now scrambling to cover their tracks. But it was too late. Word of the arrests had spread like wildfire. Guests who had been at the wedding began posting videos and photos online, capturing the entire incident from start to finish. The brutality, the unlawful detentions, the disregard for civil rights, it was all there, for the world to see. By the time the clock struck midnight, the hashtag Justice for Isabella and Daniel was trending on social media. News outlets had picked up the story, and civil rights organizations were already mobilizing, demanding accountability for the police department's actions. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear that Officer Miller and his team were in deep trouble. Meanwhile, back at the station, Isabella and Daniel were finally released, though not without further intimidation. As they stepped out of the police station hand in hand, they were met by a swarm of reporters and supporters, all eager to hear their story. A microphone was thrust in Isabella's face, and a reporter asked, "Judge Reynolds, can you tell us what happened tonight?" Isabella took a deep breath, her hand tightening around Daniel's. "Tonight, we witnessed a gross abuse of power," she began, her voice steady. What was supposed to be a celebration of love and unity was turned into a nightmare by officers who allowed their biases to dictate their actions. This isn't just about yous, it's about the rights of every person who has been targeted, silenced, and mistreated by those in power. We will not stand by and let this go unchallenged. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Daniel stepped forward. "We will be taking legal action," he added. and we won't stop until justice is served." The battle had only just begun. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal preparations. Henry, along with a team of civil rights attorneys, began gathering evidence from the night of the wedding. The videos taken by guests were crucial. They showed the officers' excessive force, the unlawful detentions, and the blatant disregard for the rights of the guests. Isabella and Daniel, still reeling from the emotional toll of the night, met with their legal team to discuss the next steps. The goal was clear: to hold Officer Miller and the police department accountable for their actions. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for everyone who had ever been victimized by abuse of power. As the lawsuit was filed and the media frenzy grew, Isabella and Daniel found themselves thrust into the spotlight. They gave interviews, attended rallies, and met with civil rights organizations to advocate for change. Their story had resonated with people across the country, sparking a conversation about racial bias in law enforcement and the need for police reform. But despite the support they received, the fight was far from over. Officer Miller and the police department had hired a high-powered legal team to defend themselves, and it was clear that they would stop at nothing to protect their reputations. The stage was set for a legal showdown that would determine not just their own futures, but the future of justice for countless others. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Henry's law office, casting soft light across the stacks of case files, legal briefs, and evidence scattered across the conference table. Isabella and Daniel, seated at one end of the table, exchanged weary glances as their legal team prepared for the long battle ahead. Though they had always known this fight for justice would be grueling, the reality of it was beginning to set in. Henry, a seasoned lawyer and Daniel's younger brother, stood at the head of the table, a stack of papers in hand. "This is going to be a tough fight," he began, addressing the group of attorneys and legal aides gathered around. "The police department's defense team is aggressive, and they're going to try to paint this as a routine investigation gone wrong." Henry's eyes flicked to his brother. "But we've got the truth on our side. The footage from the wedding, the witness testimonies, it's all there. What happened that night was a clear violation of civil rights." Isabella nodded, her face set in a mask of determination. Despite the emotional toll of the past few days, she refused to show any weakness. "We need to focus on proving that the officers acted with racial bias and used excessive force without cause," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't just about the wedding, it's about holding them accountable for years of unchecked power." Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll get justice," he said quietly. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been through this." The legal team spent hours going over the evidence. The videos taken by guests, which had gone viral in the days following the wedding, were damning. They showed officers aggressively separating guests, using unnecessary force, and treating innocent people as suspects. The footage of Officer Miller's confrontation with Isabella and Daniel, where he dismissed their credentials and escalated the situation despite their attempts to de-escalate, was especially powerful. "We need to frame this as a systemic issue," Henry explained as he scrolled through the footage on his laptop. "We're not just talking about one bad cop, we're talking about a culture of abuse that has gone unchecked for too long." The lawyers nodded in agreement, and the discussion shifted to strategy. They would file both a civil rights lawsuit against the officers involved and a separate action against the police department for failing to address the systemic issues that allowed this kind of behavior to flourish. Isabella, despite her exhaustion, leaned forward, her voice firm. "We need to make sure the officers involved are held personally responsible," she said. "This can't just end with the department paying a fine. People need to know that there are real consequences for abusing power." The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse was packed with supporters, media, and civil rights activists. The case had captured national attention, and the courtroom was filled with tension as both sides prepared for what was sure to be an intense battle. Isabella and Daniel walked into the courthouse hand in hand, their heads held high. They had spent their entire careers upholding the law, but now they were on the other side of it, seeking justice, not as officers of the court, but as victims. As they entered the courtroom, a hush fell over the crowd. The weight of the moment was palpable, and everyone knew that what happened in this trial would set a precedent for future cases of police misconduct. The defense, led by a sharp-tongued attorney named Richard Foster, wasted no time laying out their strategy. They would argue that the officers had responded to a valid noise complaint and that their actions were justified in light of the situation. Foster stood before the jury, his voice smooth but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about police officers doing their job in the face of a chaotic situation. They responded to a call, as they are required to do, and they followed protocol to ensure the safety of everyone involved." He turned to the jury, his expression one of practiced sincerity. "The plaintiffs want you to believe that this was an act of malice, that these officers were motivated by something other than their duty. But the truth is much simpler. These officers were trying to maintain order in what could have become a dangerous situation." Isabella, sitting beside Henry at the plaintiff's table, felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. Dangerous situation. They had been at their wedding, surrounded by friends and family, celebrating love and unity. There had been no threat, no danger, only the racial bias of the officers who had seen a group of black and brown faces and decided they didn't belong. When it was time for the plaintiffs to present their case, Henry stood and addressed the jury. His voice was steady, but his words were powerful. "This case is about more than just one night. It's about a pattern of abuse, a systemic issue that has plagued our country for far too long. On the night in question, my clients, Judge Isabella Reynolds and Agent Daniel Brooks, were celebrating their wedding. They were surrounded by family and friends, in the safety of their own home. But because of a baseless complaint and the biases of the responding officers, their wedding turned into a nightmare." Henry gestured to the screen where the video footage from the wedding was being projected. "What you're about to see is not just an unfortunate mistake. It's the result of a culture that treats people of color as suspects first, without cause or justification." The footage played, and the courtroom watched in silence as the events of that night unfolded on the screen. The video showed the officers entering the yard, their aggressive questioning of guests, and the physical confrontation between the officers and Daniel. The most damning footage, however, was of Officer Miller dismissing Isabella's authority as a judge and Daniel's position as an agent, choosing instead to escalate the situation despite their calm and measured responses. The jury watched as Miller mocked Isabella, telling her that her title didn't matter. They saw the officers forcibly detain guests, including children and elderly relatives, with no apparent reason other than their presence at the wedding. The videos showed the officers using excessive force, shoving people to the ground and separating families, all while ignoring the pleas for reason and calm. As the footage ended, the courtroom was silent. Henry turned back to the jury. "What you just saw was not law enforcement. It was an abuse of power, and it's something that happens far too often in communities across this country. This is our chance to hold these officers accountable, to send a message that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to protect it." Over the next few days, the trial continued with witness testimonies from guests who had been at the wedding. Tina, the mother of Jamal, took the stand and recounted the terror she had felt watching her son be treated like a criminal for simply attending a celebration. Mr. Harris, the elderly man who had been shoved to the ground, spoke of the fear and pain he had experienced, his voice trembling as he described the officers' disregard for his age and vulnerability. One by one, the guests shared their stories, painting a picture of a night that had been transformed from joyous to terrifying in the blink of an eye. Isabella, too, took the stand. Her testimony was poised and powerful. She spoke of her dedication to the law, her commitment to justice, and the pain of watching her wedding turn into a battleground. "I've spent my entire career upholding the law," Isabella said, her voice strong. "I've seen what happens when people abuse their power, and I've dedicated myself to making sure that justice is served. But on that night, I saw firsthand what happens when those in power believe they are untouchable. We cannot let this stand." Daniel's testimony was equally compelling. He described the proper protocols that should have been followed that night, pointing out every violation of procedure and the reckless disregard for the rights of those at the wedding. These officers didn't just fail to do their jobs, Daniel said. They actively undermined the principles of justice and fairness that they are sworn to protect. As the trial drew to a close, both sides made their final arguments. The defense, clinging to their narrative of chaos and misunderstanding, tried to frame the officers' actions as unfortunate but necessary. But the weight of the evidence was clear. Henry stood before the jury one last time, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. This case is about accountability.
It's about standing up to those who believe they can act with impunity simply because they wear a badge.
My clients didn't just suffer an injustice. They were humiliated, targeted, and violated in the most personal way. And it's time for those responsible to face the consequences of their actions. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation as the judge read the decision. Isabella, Daniel, and their family sat in silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. We, the jury, find the defendant's officer James Miller and the other officers involved guilty of civil rights violations, use of excessive force, and racial bias. The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Isabella felt a wave of relief wash over her, the tension that had gripped her chest for days finally releasing. Daniel squeezed her hand, his face set in a mixture of relief and determination. The police department was ordered to pay significant damages, and Officer Miller, along with several of his colleagues, was terminated from his position and faced potential criminal charges for misconduct. As they stepped outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Supporters, activists, and media swarmed them, but for the first time in days, Isabella and Daniel felt a sense of peace. Isabella stepped up to the podium, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. Today we saw justice served, but this is just the beginning. We will continue to fight for accountability, for reform, and for every person who has been wronged by those who believe they are above the law. Daniel stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, as they faced the cameras and the crowd. Their journey had been grueling, but they had emerged victorious not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been victimized by an abuse of power. And as they walked away from the courthouse hand in hand, they knew that this was just the first step in a much larger fight for justice. The courtroom battle may have ended, but for Isabella and Daniel, the fight was far from over. The verdict had been a hard-won victory, a landmark decision that brought accountability to those who had abused their power. But in the days and weeks that followed, the couple realized that this moment of triumph was not just about personal vindication. It was about pushing for lasting change. As they walked out of the courthouse, the media swarmed them, microphones thrust in their faces, cameras flashing. Civil rights advocates and supporters lined the steps, their cheers mixing with the sound of news reporters shouting for a statement. Isabella and Daniel paused on the courthouse steps, facing the crowd with a sense of purpose. Isabella, who had always been calm under pressure, took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. Her voice was steady but filled with emotion. "This victory is not just for us," she began, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "It's for every person who has ever been mistreated, silenced, or targeted by those who believe they are above the law." Daniel stood beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. "We were lucky," he said, his deep voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "We had the resources, the support, and the platform to fight back. But there are countless others who don't have that. This fight isn't over until justice is accessible for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, but Isabella and Daniel weren't interested in the accolades. They knew the real work had just begun. In the weeks following the trial, Isabella and Daniel found themselves at the center of a national conversation about police reform, civil rights, and accountability. The footage from their wedding, which had gone viral in the days after the incident, continued to spark outrage and fuel discussions about racial bias in law enforcement. Civil rights organizations, community leaders, and activists began reaching out, inviting them to speak at rallies, town halls, and forums. Isabella, once known for her calm and measured demeanor in the courtroom, now found herself taking on a new role an advocate for justice and reform. The first rally was held in their city, organized by local activists who had been fighting for police accountability long before the events of their wedding. As Isabella and Daniel stood on the stage in front of hundreds of supporters, they realized just how far-reaching the impact of their case had been. "Today we stand united," Isabella said, her voice carrying through the crowd. United against systemic injustice, united for accountability, and united in the fight for a system that serves everyone equally, no matter the color of their skin. Daniel, ever the strategist, spoke about the need for concrete reforms, body cameras, de-escalation training, and stricter oversight of police conduct. "We can't just talk about change," he said. "We need to demand it. We need to ensure that no one else has to experience what we went through." The crowd roared in agreement, and for the first time since the nightmare at their wedding, Isabella and Daniel felt a renewed sense of hope. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had been wronged by the system. While their public advocacy grew, Isabella and Daniel also had to face the emotional toll the ordeal had taken on their personal lives. The wedding, which should have been a joyous celebration of their love, had been marred by violence and injustice. The trauma of that night had left scars that wouldn't heal easily. At home, away from the cameras and the crowds, Isabella sometimes found herself staring out the window, her mind replaying the events of that night. The flashing lights, the sound of her guests being questioned like criminals, the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her wrists, it all came flooding back in waves. Daniel noticed the weight that still hung over her. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, he gently took her hand in his. "You've been quiet lately," he said softly. "What's on your mind?" Isabella looked at him, her eyes heavy with emotion. "I keep thinking about that night," she admitted. "I keep thinking about how it could have gone so much worse. What if they had hurt someone? What if they had hurt you?" Daniel pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her as if to shield her from the memories. "But they didn't," he said quietly. "We got through it, and we're stronger because of it." Isabella rested her head on his shoulder, grateful for his strength. But she knew that healing would take time. They had faced injustice head-on, and while they had won in court, the emotional wounds would take longer to mend. Despite the personal challenges they faced, Isabella and Daniel's case became a symbol of hope for people across the country. Their story was featured in national news outlets, and they were invited to speak on talk shows and at conferences about civil rights and police reform. At one event, held at a university known for its progressive activism, a young woman approached them after their speech. Her eyes were filled with admiration and hope. "You've inspired so many of us," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Because of you, we know that we can fight back, that we don't have to accept injustice." Isabella smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's why we're doing this," she said. "Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." The young woman nodded, wiping a tear from her eye. "Thank you," she whispered. As the crowd dispersed, Daniel turned to Isabella, a soft smile on his face. "I think we're making a difference," he said. Isabella nodded, a sense of purpose filling her chest. "Yes," she agreed, "but there's still so much more to do." In the months that followed the trial, Isabella and Daniel continued to push for meaningful reform. They met with lawmakers, civil rights organizations, and police reform advocates, working to draft new legislation aimed at preventing the kind of abuses they had experienced. One of their biggest victories came when the City Council passed a bill requiring mandatory body cameras for all police officers, along with strict de-escalation training protocols. The bill, which had been inspired in part by Isabella and Daniel's case, was seen as a major step forward in ensuring accountability and transparency in law enforcement. But they knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight. The road ahead was long, and the fight for justice would require constant vigilance. At a town hall meeting, Isabella spoke to a group of community members about the importance of staying engaged in the fight for reform. "We can't let up now," she said. "We've made progress, but there's still so much more to do. We need to hold our leaders accountable. We need to support those who have been wronged, and we need to keep fighting for a system that works for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, and as Isabella stepped down from the podium, Daniel met her with a proud smile. "You're amazing," he said softly, pulling her into a tight hug. Isabella smiled, feeling the warmth of his embrace. "So are you," she replied. A year had passed since the night that changed their lives. The scars of that night hadn't fully faded, but Isabella and Daniel had found peace in their work, in their love, and in the knowledge that they had made a difference. To mark the anniversary of their wedding, they decided to host a small, intimate ceremony, a wedding redo, as they called it. This time, it would be a celebration free from the shadows of injustice, surrounded by the people they loved most. The backyard, where so much had happened, was once again filled with laughter and joy. String lights twinkled above, and the soft sounds of music played as guests gathered to celebrate the couple's love. As Isabella stood at the altar, dressed in a simple but elegant white dress, she looked out at the faces of her family and friends. This time, there was no fear, no tension, only love, unity, and a sense of hope for the future. Daniel, standing beside her in a crisp suit, took her hands in his and smiled. "We made it," he whispered. Isabella nodded, her heart full. "We did." As they exchanged vows once more, there was a sense of renewal, not just in their commitment to each other, but in their commitment to the fight for justice. They knew that their story had touched lives, and that their work had only just begun. When the ceremony ended, the guests erupted into cheers, showering the couple with love and support. Isabella and Daniel kissed, sealing their vows with the knowledge that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the night wore on, the couple danced under the stars, their hearts light with joy. They had been through so much, but they had come out stronger on the other side. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that they had not only made a difference, they had created a legacy of hope and justice that would last for years to come. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, resilience, and hope. If you found this story inspiring and want to hear more stories about standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on new stories. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and don't forget to share this story with others who believe in the power of justice and love. See you in the next story. He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made Naomi's heart skip a beat. "Naomi," he said, standing up and walking over to her. "I didn't expect to see you here." Naomi shrugged, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I wanted to see what you've been working on." Ethan nodded, gesturing to the office around them. "It's still a work in progress, but we're making headway. I want this to be something real, something that can help people." Naomi studied him for a moment before speaking. "It's a good start, Ethan. But you know this isn't just about the foundation. It's about you, too." Ethan nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. "I know, and am working on that, too. I'm not the man I used to be, Naomi. I don't want to be." Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to believe him, and maybe, just maybe, she was starting to. Months passed, and as time went on, the walls between Naomi and Ethan slowly began to come down. They started spending more time together, not as business partners or adversaries, but as two people trying to build something real. Their conversations became deeper, more honest, and Naomi found herself opening up to Ethan in ways she hadn't before. Ethan, too, had changed. He was no longer driven by the need for control or the desire to win at all costs. Instead, he was focused on being the kind of man Naomi could trust, someone who cared about more than just success and power. One evening, as they sat together in the living room of Naomi's apartment, Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been thinking about this moment for weeks, planning it carefully, but now that it was here, he couldn't help but feel nervous. "Naomi," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I know that we didn't start off on the right foot. I know that I hurt you and that I still have a lot to make up for. But I also know that I've fallen in love with you. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I can be the man you deserve." Naomi's breath caught in her throat as Ethan pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple, elegant engagement ring. The diamonds sparkled in the soft light, But what struck Naomi most was the sincerity in Ethan's eyes. "Will you marry me?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but steady. "For real this time?" Naomi stared at the ring, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never expected this, never thought that she could fall in love with the man who had once been the source of so much pain. But now, sitting here with him, she knew that things had changed. Ethan had changed. And so had she. With a soft smile, Naomi nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "I'll marry you." Ethan's face lit up with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms. They kissed, the weight of the past finally lifting from their shoulders, leaving only the promise of a future filled with love, hope, and healing. The months leading up to their wedding were filled with joy and anticipation. But there was one final challenge that Ethan had to face before he could truly move on from his past. A major competitor of Cole Enterprises, sensing weakness in the company's recent shift in strategy, launched a hostile takeover bid, threatening everything Ethan had worked for. It was a test of Ethan's new approach to life. In the past, he would have responded with aggression, using every tool at his disposal to crush the competition and maintain control. But now, Ethan knew that the old ways wouldn't work not if he wanted to stay true to the man he was becoming. Naomi stood by his side as Ethan navigated the challenges of the takeover bid. She could see the strain it was putting on him, but she also knew that this was an important moment for him. A chance to prove that he could lead his company with integrity and fairness, rather than greed and ruthlessness. Ethan worked tirelessly with his team, negotiating with the competing firm and coming up with a solution that protected his employees and the company's future without resorting to underhanded tactics. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Ethan was tempted to revert to his old ways, but each time he remembered what was at stake: not just his business, but his relationship with Naomi and his own sense of self. In the end, the deal was struck, and the company was saved. Ethan had passed the final test, proving to himself and to Naomi that he could change, that he could be the man she believed he could be. The day of their wedding arrived, and it was a day filled with love, joy, and hope. Unlike their first wedding, which had been cold and businesslike, this one was filled with emotion. Their closest friends and family gathered in a beautiful garden to celebrate the union of two people who had fought hard to find their way to each other. Naomi stood at the altar in a simple, elegant gown, her heart full as she looked at Ethan standing beside her. He was no longer the arrogant CEO she had once despised. He was a man who had learned to put others before himself, a man who had earned her trust and her love. As they exchanged vows, there was no doubt in Naomi's mind that this was where she was meant to be. She had spent years searching for closure, for justice, but in the end, she had found something much more powerful: love.
Ethan's voice was filled with emotion as he promised to love and cherish Naomi for the...
He knew that this marriage was the start of something new, not just for them as a couple, but for him as a man. He had finally let go of the need for control, and in doing so, he had found something far more valuable: someone to share his life with. When the ceremony ended and they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the crowd erupted into cheers, but for Ethan and Naomi, the world around them faded away. It was just the two of them, standing together, ready to face whatever the future held. Months after the wedding, Naomi discovered she was pregnant. The news filled both her and Ethan with a sense of joy and hope for the future. It was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one that would be filled with love, family, and the lessons they had learned along the way. Ethan continued his work with the foundation, helping small businesses rebuild and thrive, while Naomi used her expertise in event planning to support the foundation's efforts. Together, they built a life that was focused not on power or control, but on making a positive difference in the world. As they prepared for the arrival of their child, Naomi and Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought them together. It hadn't been easy. There had been pain, betrayal, and heartache, but through it all, they had found their way to each other. They had learned that love wasn't about winning or losing, was about trust, respect, and the willingness to grow together. In the quiet moments before the baby was born, Ethan held Naomi close, his heart full of gratitude for the second chance they had been given. "Who would have thought," Naomi whispered with a smile, resting her head on his shoulder, "that everything would start with a bet?" Ethan chuckled softly, kissing the top of her head. "It's the best bet I ever made." And with that, they looked toward the future, ready to face whatever came their way, knowing that they had each other, and that was more than enough. In the months following their wedding, Ethan found himself grappling with the gravity of his past decisions in a way he had never anticipated. The foundation he had set up in Naomi's father's name was thriving, helping small businesses survive and flourish in ways his company once prevented. He was proud of the work he was doing, but there was always a weight that hung over him, a constant reminder of the damage he had caused. Despite his efforts to make things right, there were moments when Ethan doubted whether he could ever fully redeem himself in the eyes of those he had hurt. The guilt was a burden he carried quietly, not wanting to disrupt the newfound peace and joy he had found with Naomi. But it was always there, simmering beneath the surface. Naomi, too, sensed this shift in Ethan. She noticed the way he would grow quiet at times, lost in thought. She knew that he was still haunted by his past, and though she admired his commitment to change, she worried that he was carrying too much of the burden on his own. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Naomi reached out and placed her hand gently on Ethan's arm. "You've done so much, Ethan," she said softly. "I see how hard you're trying, but you don't have to carry all of this alone." Ethan looked at her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully make up for everything I've done. No matter how much good I try to do now, it doesn't erase the past." Naomi's eyes softened. "You can't change the past, Ethan. But what matters is that you're different now. You've made amends, and you're continuing to do so. That's what's important." Ethan sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I just don't want to let you down. I don't want to let anyone down." Naomi leaned in closer, her voice filled with warmth. "You haven't let me down. In fact, you've shown me that people can change. And that's something I never thought I'd believe." Ethan's heart swelled at her words, and for the first time in a long while, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. He realized that he didn't have to carry this alone. Naomi was with him, not just as his wife, but as his partner in this journey of redemption. As Naomi's pregnancy progressed, both she and Ethan found themselves preparing for the next chapter of their lives' parenthood. The news of their baby had brought a wave of excitement and anticipation, but it had also introduced new challenges and uncertainties. Naomi, who had spent so many years focused on her career and her personal mission of justice, was suddenly faced with the reality that she would soon be responsible for a new life. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She often found herself wondering if she was ready for this next step, if she could balance motherhood with the independence and strength she had fought so hard to maintain. Ethan, on the other hand, was determined to be the father he had never known growing up. His own childhood had been marked by distance and emotional absence, with his parents more concerned with their businesses than with him. Ethan didn't want that for his child. He wanted to be present, to be a father who loved and supported his family in every way. But with that desire came fear. Ethan was still learning how to balance the demands of his company, the foundation, and his personal life. He worried that he might fall into the same traps his parents had, working too much, focusing on power and success instead of what truly mattered. One afternoon, as they were setting up the nursery, Ethan voiced his concerns to Naomi. "I don't want to mess this up," he admitted, as he fumbled with the instructions for the crib. "I don't want to be the kind of father who's always at work, who misses everything because he's too focused on business." Naomi smiled softly, watching him struggle with the crib. "You won't be, Ethan. You're not the same person you used to be." Ethan looked up at her, his brow furrowed. "What if I am? What if I fall back into old habits? What if I don't know how to do this?" Naomi walked over to him and gently took the screwdriver from his hand, her touch reassuring. "You're already doing it, Ethan. You're here. You care. And that's what matters. Well, figure the rest out together." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. Naomi's confidence in him was something he had come to rely on. And in that moment, he realized that they truly were partners in every sense of the word. As the due date for the baby approached, Naomi found herself reflecting on her father's memory more and more. She had spent years grieving for him, her anger at Ethan's company fueling her mission for revenge. But now, with her life in a completely different place, she wondered what her father would think of the woman she had become and the man she had chosen to share her life with. Naomi decided to visit her father's grave, something she hadn't done in a long time. She asked Ethan to come with her, wanting him to understand this part of her life, this part of her journey. They arrived at the cemetery on a cool, quiet afternoon. Naomi stood in front of her father's headstone, her emotions swirling inside her. She placed a hand on the stone, her mind flooded with memories of the man who had once been her hero. Ethan stood beside her, his presence steady and supportive. He didn't say anything at first, giving Naomi the space she needed. "I used to come here all the time," Naomi said quietly. "I'd sit here and talk to him, tell him about everything that was happening in my life. It was like I was trying to keep him close, even after he was gone." Ethan nodded, understanding. "I'm sorry, I never got to meet him." Naomi smiled sadly. "He would have liked you, I think. Eventually?" Ethan chuckled softly, though his heart ached knowing how much pain his company had caused Naomi and her family. "I hope so." Naomi took a deep breath, her eyes still on the headstone. I think I'm finally ready to let go of the anger, of the pain. It's been a part of me for so long, but I don't want to carry it anymore. I don't want to pass it on to our child." Ethan's heart swelled with emotion as he reached out and took Naomi's hand. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Naomi squeezed his hand, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt like she could truly move forward toward a future filled with love, hope, and healing. The day Naomi and Ethan had been waiting for finally arrived when Naomi went into labor late one night. The rush to the hospital was filled with nervous excitement, but beneath it all was a sense of calm, a sense that they were ready for this next step in their journey together. Ethan stayed by Naomi's side throughout the entire process, holding her hand and offering words of encouragement as she labored to bring their child into the world. It was an intense emotional experience, but they faced it together, just as they had faced every challenge in their relationship. When their daughter Emma was finally born, Ethan's heart overflowed with love and awe. He held the tiny baby in his arms, his eyes filling with tears as he looked at Naomi, who was exhausted but radiant with happiness. "She's perfect," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Naomi smiled, her own eyes filled with tears as she reached out to touch their daughter's tiny hand. "She is." As they held their newborn daughter, Ethan and Naomi knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the family they were building, the love they were nurturing, and the future they were creating together. Life with a newborn was challenging, but it was also filled with moments of pure joy. Naomi and Ethan quickly settled into their roles as parents, each of them learning as they went. There were sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and moments of exhaustion. But there were also moments of overwhelming love and connection. Ethan took time away from his company to focus on being present for Naomi and Emma. He had made a promise to himself and to Naomi that he wouldn't let work consume him the way it once had. He wanted to be there for every milestone, every first word, every new discovery. Naomi, too, found herself adjusting to the balance between motherhood and her career. She had scaled back her event planning business to focus on her family, but she still found joy in the work she did for the foundation, knowing that she was making a difference in the lives of others. As the months went by, Naomi and Ethan continued to build their life together. Their love for each other had deepened, strengthened by the trials they had faced, and the growth they had experienced as individuals and as a couple. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their home, watching the sunset with Emma asleep in her crib, Ethan reached out and took Naomi's hand. "I never thought my life would look like this," Ethan said softly, his gaze on the horizon. "But I'm so glad it does." Naomi smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past finally behind them. They had overcome so much pain, betrayal, guilt, but through it all, they had found each other. And in that, they had found the kind of love and redemption that few ever experienced. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a golden glow over the city, Naomi and Ethan knew that their journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more highs and lows, but they would face them together, with the love they had built guiding them forward. And with that love, they were ready to embrace whatever the future held. The months following Emma's birth were a whirlwind for both Ethan and Naomi. Parenthood, while a beautiful and fulfilling experience, also came with its own set of challenges. Between late-night feedings and early morning diaper changes, Ethan and Naomi found themselves navigating an entirely new world. But amidst the sleepless nights, they also shared countless moments of joy-first smiles, tiny hands grasping their fingers, and the unmistakable bond of a growing family. For Ethan, the experience of fatherhood was transformative. Every moment with Emma reminded him of how far he had come from the man he used to be. He cherished the quiet mornings he spent with her, feeding her and watching her fall asleep in his arms. More than anything, Ethan wanted to be a present and loving father, something he had lacked in his own childhood. Naomi, too, was adjusting to her new role as a mother, learning to balance the demands of parenthood with her professional ambitions. She had always prided herself on her independence, her career, and her drive to succeed. Now, she was learning how to be all of those things while also being the best mother she could be to Emma. Some days were easier than others, and she often found herself relying on Ethan's support to get through the tougher moments. One day, after a particularly long morning juggling Emma's needs and a conference call for the foundation, Naomi sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, exhausted but content. Ethan joined her, taking a seat across from her and reaching for her hand. "You're doing amazing," he said softly, his eyes full of admiration. Naomi smiled, squeezing his hand. "So are you." They had come a long way from the lives they had once led. Together, they were learning to balance parenthood with their individual goals and dreams. The foundation in Elijah's name continued to grow, with Naomi leading the charge to expand its reach. She was passionate about helping small businesses thrive and protecting them from the kinds of corporate greed that had once destroyed her father's company. Ethan had also shifted his focus, spending less time in the office and more time working on philanthropic projects. He had become deeply involved in the foundation, using his business acumen to help guide the organization's growth. It was a new kind of success for Himone that wasn't measured in profits or power, but in the positive impact he was making on the world. As they sat together in the quiet of their home, with Emma napping in the next room, Naomi and Ethan realized that they had found the balance they had once feared they wouldn't. They were parents, professionals, and partners in every sense of the word. Just as Ethan and Naomi were settling into their new life, a new challenge presented itself in the form of a business deal that threatened to disrupt the progress they had made with the foundation. One of the largest corporate players in the city, a conglomerate known for aggressive acquisitions, had expressed interest in partnering with Cole Enterprises. The deal promised substantial financial benefits, but Naomi was wary. The conglomerate had a reputation for using partnerships as a stepping stone to take control of smaller organizations, something that struck too close to home for Naomi. She didn't want Ethan's company, or the foundation, to fall prey to the same kind of tactics that had once destroyed her father's business. Ethan was aware of the conglomerate's reputation, but he also recognized the potential benefits of the deal. The decision was difficult. On one hand, the deal could help Cole Enterprises and the foundation grow in ways he hadn't previously imagined. On the other hand, it risked everything they had worked to build. During a tense dinner conversation, Ethan laid out the details of the deal to Naomi. He was transparent about his reservations, but wanted her perspective. "I know what this could mean for the foundation," Ethan said, his tone measured, but concerned. "But I also don't want to put everything we've built at risk." Naomi listened carefully, her mind racing. She could see the appeal of the deal, but she also knew the danger of partnering with a company that valued profits over people. I understand why you're considering it, Naomi said finally. But I think we need to look at the long-term impact, not just the immediate gains. We've worked so hard to protect small businesses from this kind of corporate overreach. If we partner with them, even if it's lucrative, we risk losing control of everything we've built. Ethan nodded, appreciating her perspective. You're right. I don't want to make the same mistakes I've made in the past. This time, it has to be about more than just the money. They decided to meet with the executives of the conglomerate to discuss their concerns directly. Ethan was firm in his stance, making it clear that any partnership would have to respect the autonomy of the foundation and the businesses they supported. If the conglomerate wasn't willing to agree to those terms, the deal would be off the table. After a series of intense negotiations, Ethan and Naomi were able to walk away from the deal, confident that they had made the right decision. It was a pivotal moment for both of them, reaffirming their commitment to protecting what mattered most, each other, their family, and the legacy they were building. The decision to walk away from the conglomerate's offer turned out to be a turning point for the foundation. Word of Ethan and Naomi's integrity spread through the business community, and they began to receive more support than ever before. Small businesses saw them as allies, and the foundation's mission to protect and uplift entrepreneurs gained momentum. Naomi and Ethan decided to launch a new initiative, a mentorship program that would connect struggling small business owners with successful entrepreneurs willing to share their knowledge and resources. The program aimed to provide not just financial support, but the guidance and mentorship that so many businesses lacked. One of the first businesses they helped through the mentorship program was a family-owned bakery that had been struggling to stay afloat. The owners, an older couple named Maria and Jaws, had poured their life savings into the bakery, but a series of unfortunate events had left them on the brink of bankruptcy. Naomi took a personal interest in their case, meeting with them regularly to discuss ways to restructure the business and cut unnecessary costs. Ethan, too, became involved, offering financial support and connecting them with other successful business owners who could offer advice. Over the course of several months, the bakery not only survived but began to thrive. Maria and Jos were able to expand their operations, hire more staff, and increase their profits. It was a success story that deeply resonated with Naomi, reminding her of why she had started this journey in the first place. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Naomi said one evening as she and Ethan walked through the city together, reflecting on the bakery's turnaround. "Seeing people succeed, knowing that we played a part in that." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "It is. It feels different than anything I've ever done before. Better. They had built something meaningful, something that went beyond personal success. Together, they were making a real difference in people's lives, and that was a legacy they could be proud of." As the foundation's impact grew, so did Naomi and Ethan's vision for the future. They realized that the work they were doing had the potential to expand far beyond the city limits of New York. There were small businesses across the country, and even the world, that could benefit from the programs they had developed. With this in mind, Naomi proposed an ambitious plan to take the foundation's mission national. They would open satellite offices in major cities across the United States, bringing their mentorship and financial support programs to entrepreneurs who needed it most. Ethan was immediately on board. He had seen firsthand how much the foundation had accomplished, and he knew that expanding their reach would only amplify that success. The plan wasn't without its challenges, however. Expanding the foundation would require a significant amount of resources, and they needed to be strategic about where they opened new offices to ensure they were reaching the communities that needed them most. Naomi and Ethan spent months traveling to different cities, meeting with local business owners, and assessing the needs of each community. They wanted to make sure that they were creating something sustainable, something that would have a lasting impact. Finally, after months of planning and preparation, the first satellite office opened in Chicago. It was a momentous occasion, marked by a ribbon-cutting ceremony and speeches from local officials who praised the work Naomi and Ethan were doing. As they stood together, watching the ribbon fall and the doors to the new office open, Naomi felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was the culmination of everything they had worked for, their shared vision, their dedication, and their desire to make the world a better place. And they weren't done yet. Years passed, and Naomi and Ethan's lives continued to grow and evolve. Emma, now a lively and curious toddler, brought endless joy to their days. She had inherited both her parents' strength and determination, and Naomi often found herself marveling at the little girl's spirit. The foundation continued to expand, with satellite offices now in several major cities across the country. Naomi and Ethan had become known not just as successful business leaders, but as advocates for small businesses and champions of fair, ethical business practices. As they reflected on their journey together, Naomi and Ethan realized that they had built something far greater than they had ever imagined. Their legacy wasn't just in the businesses they had saved or the people they had helped. It was in the love they had for each other, the family they had built, and the values they had instilled in their work. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their home, watching Emma play in the yard, Ethan turned to Naomi with a smile. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Naomi laughed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "All the time." Ethan reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I wouldn't trade any of it for the world. Not the challenges, not the mistakes. Everything brought us to this moment." Naomi smiled, her heart full. "I feel the same way. We've built something amazing, Ethan, and we're just getting started." Together, they looked out at the horizon, knowing that their journey was far from over. But no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with love, determination, and the strength of the legacy they had created. And as they sat there, hand in hand, they knew that their story was one of redemption, growth, and the power of love to transform even the most broken of beginnings into something beautiful and lasting. As the foundation continued to grow, Naomi and Ethan felt a sense of pride and fulfillment in all they had achieved. The mentorship programs, financial aid initiatives, and expansion into new cities had created a ripple effect, transforming not only individual businesses, but entire communities. Yet, just as life seemed to be settling into a peaceful rhythm, the universe had one more surprise in store for them. It started with Naomi feeling unusually fatigued, and though she initially chalked it up to the demands of balancing work and motherhood, something about this exhaustion felt different. One evening, as she prepared dinner with Ethan, she paused mid-conversation, feeling a wave of dizziness that made her sit down. Ethan noticed immediately, concern flashing across his face. "Are you okay?" Naomi nodded but took a deep breath. "I've just been feeling off lately. I'm sure it's nothing, but maybe I should go see a doctor, just to be sure." The next morning, Naomi made an appointment, expecting to hear that she was just overworked and needed some rest. But when the doctor gave her the news, she was completely taken aback. "You're pregnant, Naomi," the doctor said with a smile, looking at her chart. "It's early, but everything looks good." Naomi's heart skipped a beat as the reality of the words sank in. Pregnant. She hadn't been expecting this. She and Ethan had been so focused on Emma, the foundation, and their work. A second child hadn't even been part of their immediate plans. Later that evening, Naomi sat down with Ethan in their living room, still trying to process the news. Ethan could sense that something was on her mind. "Is everything okay?" he asked, placing a hand on hers. Naomi took a deep breath, then smiled. "I went to the doctor today." Ethan's concern deepened, but before he could ask, Naomi continued. "I'm pregnant, Ethan." Ethan blinked, his surprise evident. But within moments, his expression shifted to one of pure joy. "Pregnant," he repeated, his voice filled with awe. "We're going to have another baby." Naomi nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, we are." Ethan pulled her into his arms, laughing softly as he held her close. "I can't believe it. This is incredible." Naomi smiled through her tears, feeling a wave of happiness wash over her. It wasn't what they had planned, but it was a beautiful surprise. And as she looked into Ethan's eyes, she knew that they were ready for this next chapter, no matter what challenges or surprises lay ahead. The news of Naomi's pregnancy brought joy to their family. but it also came with its share of challenges. Balancing the demands of their growing family, the foundation, and their professional lives was not going to be easy. Both Naomi and Ethan were committed to continuing the work they had started, but they knew they needed to adjust, ensure that their family remained their top priority. Naomi decided to take a step back from the day-to-day operations of the foundation, delegating more responsibilities to her team. She trusted the people she had hired, and though it was difficult for her to relinquish control, she knew that her family needed her now more than ever. Ethan, too, made changes. He reduced his involvement in coal enterprises, handing over more of the business operations to his trusted executives. He had built a company that could run without his constant oversight, and now he was ready to focus on what truly mattered: his family and our foundation's mission. Together, they planned to ensure that their growing family would have the time and attention it deserved. They hired additional help around the house, creating a support system that allowed them to balance their personal and professional lives without feeling overwhelmed. Despite their best efforts, there were still moments of doubt and stress. Naomi, in particular, struggled with the idea of stepping back from the foundation. It had been her lifeline for so long, a way to honor her father's memory and make a difference in the world. Now she worried that she was abandoning it at a critical time. One evening, as she sat in the nursery, organizing Emma's toys, Naomi confided her concerns to Ethan. "I feel like I'm letting the foundation down," she admitted. "It's my father's legacy, and I've worked so hard to build it. But now, with another baby on the way, I'm not sure if I can give it the attention it needs." Ethan knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. "You're not letting anyone down, Naomi. The foundation is stronger than ever, and that's because of you.
You've built something incredible, and now it's time to trust your team to carry it forward."
Naomi sighed, leaning her head against Ethan's shoulder. "I know you're right. It's just hard to let go." Ethan kissed the top of her head, his voice gentle. "You're not letting go, you're just shifting your focus for a while. And the foundation will always be there. You've built something that's going to last for generations." Naomi smiled, feeling reassured by his words. "Thank you." They sat together in the quiet of the nursery, knowing that no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together. As Naomi's pregnancy progressed, the anticipation of their new baby brought excitement and a sense of renewal to their lives. Ethan and Naomi found themselves daydreaming about the future, imagining what life would be like with 2 children, and the memories they would create as a family. In preparation for the baby, they spent time renovating the house, creating a new nursery, and planning for the future. Emma, still too young to fully understand what was happening, seemed intrigued by the changes around her. She would toddle into the nursery, point at the crib, and babble excitedly, as if sensing the excitement in the air. One evening, as Naomi and Ethan sat on the porch after putting Emma to bed, they talked about the changes that were coming and how much their lives had evolved since they first met. "Do you ever think about where we were just a few years ago?" Naomi asked, her voice thoughtful. "Everything we've been through, everything that's changed. It feels like a lifetime ago." Ethan smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "I think about it all the time, and I wouldn't change a thing." Naomi laughed softly. "Not even the part where I hated you." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Even that? It brought us here, didn't it?" Naomi nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "It did, and I'm so grateful for that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars twinkle above them. Their journey had been anything but smooth, but they had come out stronger because of it. They had built a life filled with love, purpose, and hope for the future. As they looked toward the horizon, they knew that this new chapter, this new life, was just the beginning of something even more beautiful. The day of their second child's birth arrived in a flurry of excitement and nerves. Naomi went into labor early one morning, and after a rushed drive to the hospital, they found themselves in the familiar but still awe-inspiring experience of bringing a new life into the world. Ethan stayed by Naomi's side throughout the entire process, offering her words of encouragement and holding her hand through every contraction. It was an intense and emotional experience, but they faced it together, just as they had with Emma. When their son, Ethan Jr., was born, Naomi and Ethan were overwhelmed with emotion. The moment they held him in their arms, all the challenges, fears, and uncertainties melted away, replaced by an all-encompassing love that filled their hearts. "He's perfect," Naomi whispered, gazing down at their newborn son. Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with tears of joy, just like his sister. As they held their son, surrounded by the quiet of the hospital room, Naomi and Ethan knew that their family was complete. They had been through so much to get to this point, and now, with two beautiful children and a life filled with purpose, they felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The next few days were filled with visits from family and friends, each one marveling at the newest addition to the family. Emma, still curious about her new brother, gently patted his head and giggled at his tiny hands and feet. Watching their two children together, Naomi and Ethan knew that they had built something beautiful, something that would last for generations. Their love, their commitment to each other, and their dedication to their family had brought them here, and they couldn't wait to see what the future held. With the birth of their second child, Naomi and Ethan entered a new phase of their lives, one filled with the joys and challenges of raising two young children while continuing their work with the Foundation and Cole Enterprises. Though their days were busy and sometimes chaotic, they felt a deep sense of fulfillment in knowing that they were building something lasting, not just for themselves, but for their children and the communities they served. As the years went by, Naomi and Ethan continued to expand the Foundation's reach, opening new offices across the country and even internationally. Their mentorship and financial support programs had helped thousands of small businesses thrive, and their commitment to ethical business practices had earned them widespread respect. Their children, Emma and Ethan Jr., grew up surrounded by love and the values their parents had worked so hard to instill in them: integrity, kindness, and a commitment to helping others. Naomi and Ethan made sure to teach them the importance of giving back, often taking them to Foundation events and showing them firsthand the impact their work was having on people's lives. One evening, as Naomi and Ethan stood together at a gala celebrating the Foundation's 10th anniversary, they took a moment to reflect on everything they had built. The room was filled with people whose lives had been changed by the Foundation, and as they looked out over the crowd, they felt a profound sense of pride. "Can you believe it's been 10 years?" Naomi asked, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan smiled, slipping his arm around her waist. "It feels like it's flown by." Naomi nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "Look at all these people, all the lives we've touched. I never imagined we'd be here." Ethan kissed her temple, his heart full. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Naomi turned to him, her expression soft. "We have, and I wouldn't change a thing." As the night went on, they danced together, their love for each other stronger than ever. They had built a legacy that honored Naomi's father, helped countless people, and would live on long after they were gone. And as they swayed to the music, surrounded by the people they had touched and the love they had built, they knew that their journey was far from over. There were still more lives to change, more challenges to face, and more love to give. But for now, they were content in the knowledge that they had created something truly beautiful together. As the night of the gala ended, Naomi and Ethan stood hand in hand, watching the lights dim and the guests slowly leave. The love they had built, the family they cherished, and the legacy they had created with the Foundation filled them with an overwhelming sense of pride and peace. They had grown together, turning pain into purpose, and now they were ready for whatever the future held. Ethan smiled, looking at Naomi. "Here's to the next chapter, whatever it may bring." Naomi returned his smile, leaning into him. "As long as we're together, I know we can face anything." With that, they turned toward the future, confident that they had built a life that would continue to make a difference for years to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, redemption, and growth. If this story touched your heart and inspired you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. We love hearing from you, so share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue to explore the power of storytelling together. She had faced them from the very beginning of her fight for Ethan, and now she was facing them on a larger scale. But she remained steadfast in her belief that restorative justice and empathy were the keys to unlocking a child's potential. One particular challenge arose when a major school district in the South resisted the implementation of restorative practices, despite overwhelming evidence of their effectiveness in other districts. The district's board members argued that their community had different values and that the reforms would undermine authority in the classroom. Vanessa traveled to the district to meet with the board members and teachers, determined to convince them of the benefits of change. She shared stories from schools where students had once been labeled as troublemakers but had flourished under the new system. She brought data that showed how suspensions and dropouts had decreased, while academic performance and engagement had improved. "I understand that change is hard," Vanessa said during the meeting, her voice calm but firm. "But if we want our children to succeed, we need to create environments where they feel supported, not afraid. Discipline should be about guidance, not punishment. It's about helping students see that they are more than their mistakes." The debate was intense, but by the end of the meeting, several board members had softened. One of them, Mr. Jameson, a veteran educator who had initially been skeptical, approached Vanessa afterward. "I'll admit, I wasn't sold on this at first, Mr. Jameson said, his tone thoughtful, "but you've given me a lot to think about. Maybe we've been too focused on controlling kids and not enough on helping them grow." Vanessa smiled. "That's all I ask, that we take a step back and think about what's best for the kids. It's never too late to change." By the end of the year, the district had begun piloting restorative justice programs in several schools. Vanessa knew it would be a long road, but the progress was undeniable. The conversation was changing, and that was the first step toward lasting reform. As Vanessa's influence continued to grow, she found herself in a new role mentoring young advocates who were inspired by her work. Parents, teachers, and students alike sought her guidance, eager to learn how they could bring about change in their own communities. One of those young advocates was Sophie Adams, a passionate college student studying education and social justice. Sophie had been following Vanessa's work since high school and had reached out, asking if she could intern with Every Child Matters. During their first meeting, Sophie was nervous but excited. "I've been following your work for years, Mrs. Parker," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I want to be part of this movement. I want to help change the system for kids like me, kids who felt like they didn't belong." Vanessa smiled, remembering how she had once felt just as nervous and unsure of her own power. "You're already part of the movement, Sophie. By speaking up, you're making a difference." Under Vanessa's mentorship, Sophie quickly grew into a confident advocate. She traveled with Vanessa to meetings, helped organize events, and even began giving talks of her own. Her energy and passion reminded Vanessa of herself when she first started fighting for Ethan, and it was clear that Sophie had a bright future ahead. During one of their last meetings before Sophie graduated, Vanessa gave her a piece of advice that had guided her throughout her own journey. "Never underestimate the power of your voice," Vanessa said. "Even when it feels like no one is listening, keep speaking up. You never know who's hearing your words and how they might be inspired by them." Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I won't forget that. Thank you, Mrs. Parker. You've changed my life." Vanessa watched as Sophie went on to launch her own advocacy campaign, focused on reforming education policies in underfunded urban schools. It was a reminder that the fight was being carried forward, not just by Vanessa, but by a new generation of leaders. As Every Child Matters gained international recognition, Vanessa began receiving invitations to speak at global conferences on education reform. Countries around the world were struggling with similar issues: outdated disciplinary practices, unequal access to education, and the need for more inclusive teaching methods. One of the most impactful invitations came from the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization UNESCO. They wanted Vanessa to be a keynote speaker at their Global Education Summit, where leaders from over 50 countries would gather to discuss the future of education worldwide. Vanessa felt both honored and overwhelmed. The summit represented the culmination of everything she had worked for, and it was an opportunity to take her message to a global audience. During her speech, Vanessa spoke not just about the changes she had helped bring about in the U.S., but about the universal need for empathy and understanding in education. She emphasized that every child, no matter where they were in the world, deserved to feel valued and supported. Education is the foundation of our future, Vanessa said, her voice resonating through the large conference hall. But it's not enough to teach facts and figures. We must teach compassion, resilience, and the belief that every child has something unique to offer. When we create environments that nurture those qualities, we're not just preparing students for school, we're preparing them for life. Her speech was met with a standing ovation, and Vanessa left the summit knowing that her work had now reached a global stage. The fight for educational equity and justice was no longer confined to one country, it was a movement that spanned the globe. Years later, Vanessa found herself back where it all began, at Lincoln Elementary, the school where she had first stood up for Ethan and challenged the system that had failed him. The school had been transformed in the years since, becoming a model for restorative justice and inclusive education. The hallways were filled with laughter and energy, and the students walked with a confidence that was once absent. Vanessa had been invited to the school's annual Student Achievement Day, a celebration of the students' academic and personal growth. As she walked through the halls, she passed by a group of students who were part of a peer mentoring program, that had been inspired by Ethan's own work as a mentor years ago. One of the students, Maya, approached Vanessa with a shy smile. "Are you Mrs. Parker? My teacher told us about you. She said you helped make this school what it is today." Vanessa smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I guess you could say that. But it wasn't just me. It was a lot of people working together to make things better." Maya's eyes lit up. "I want to be like you when I grow up. I want to help people." Vanessa knelt down to meet Maya's eyes. "You already are helping, just by being kind and standing up for what's right. Keep doing that, and you'll change the world." As the ceremony began, Vanessa took her seat in the audience, watching as the students were called up to receive their awards. When Ethan's name was announced as a special guest speaker, Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't known he would be speaking. Ethan stood at the podium, looking out at the young faces in the crowd. He spoke about his own journey, how he had once been a scared little boy, isolated and unsure of himself, but how his mother's fight for him had given him the courage to believe in himself. "My mom taught me that we all have the power to make a difference," Ethan said, his voice steady. "No matter how small we feel, no matter how big the challenges seem, we can create change. We can lift each other up, and that's what I want each of you to remember. You matter, and your voice matters." As Ethan finished his speech, Vanessa felt tears in her eyes. It was a full-circle memento reminder of how far they had come and how much they had accomplished together. The world had changed because of their fight, and the future was brighter than ever. As the ceremony ended and the students filed out, Vanessa and Ethan walked together through the halls of Lincoln Elementary, side by side. They had started this journey together, and they would continue it, forever fighting for the belief that every child, everywhere, deserved a chance to shine. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. "You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, We are never truly alone.